Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
I want us to answer, why did Jesus have to die? I want us to hear from the Apostle Paul initially. He says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. You have sinned. And at the exact same time, God, his justice is perfect. Peter says he, that's Jesus, personally carried our sin in his body on the cross that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be the just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So, why did Jesus have to die? To satisfy God's perfect, eternal, and divine justice, to demonstrate God's perfect love, so we could be divinely forgiven, a new creation, and have peace with God. This is why we call it good news.
So, Buck, this week is Easter. Coming up on Easter this Sunday.
It is.
Saturday, Sunday. Feels like we moved Easter to a different day.
It seems to change every year, too.
I want to know. We've been talking about this unicorn photo booth.
Oh.
Which, when I first heard it, I thought, who's gonna go to, and then I thought, no, I totally want Grayson to get a picture of the unicorn. I don't know why. Like, we're not gonna frame that. Maybe
Right.
one day we'll open up a box and dust
Yeah.
and be like, here's a picture of, you with a
Right.
unicorn. But that's the only legitimate So my question for you is, are you going to take a picture with the unicorn?
Well, I have to say two things on that. Number one, you just kind of dated yourself because you're like, one day I'm going to open a box.
Yeah.
That's old school, baby.
Well, we're doing
My
that. I know.
generation
Yeah,
open
yeah.
box. You open a computer. Like one day we're going to open like our TV screen and we're
That's
going to look
fair.
at this old picture.
Well, we're looking at pictures of me as a baby right now,
Oh,
and we're opening boxes
Yeah.
that my parents had.
See?
So yeah.
Yeah, it's that
But
old
that's
soul
fair.
that
That's
comes
fair.
out.
Yeah, I don't have any boxes of pictures for me. So
Yeah, so secondly, am I looking forward to getting a picture with a unicorn?
I was just meant, were you going to?
Oh, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Hadn't even crossed your mind yet.
Well, when I heard that, because we have one of our volunteers is fantastic, is organizing all these activities on Saturday, and Julie was telling me, my assistant, she was like, "Hey, we're gonna have a unicorn," and I was like, "What?" And so it's pretty exciting. I'm most curious to see what it looks like.
Well, it's gonna be like a mini pony with a carrot strapped to its forehead.
Sure.
And that's probably
Yeah.
yeah.
So we'll see how the carrot on the mini pony looks.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a carrot. That was the thing. Horses eat carrots.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
To ride on the back. But
Yeah.
But if you were to like talk about the unicorn with the other half of our staff members who are potentially more alive and less pragmatic than you and I, they are so excited about it.
Yeah.
So-
we've got several of our creative staff members who are like giddy.
Yeah, they're like, a unicorn?
I know.
And it's like they exist or something.
Yeah, so we'll see. All coming very shortly this Saturday.
Well, I love the whole theme of Easter is here's what's true, here's what happened, and we're like, there's a magical creature outside.
I know. Yeah, that may not have been the best, but
Yeah,
we'll
that's
see
good.
how it goes.
Anyways, we're not there yet. We're wrapping up Why Did Jesus? So you wrapped up part 4 this past Sunday, and kind of leading up to Easter, the resurrection, first Jesus' death, and honing in on the question of why did Jesus have to die?
Yeah.
And I love the way you phrased it. Like we could say, well, he died for my sins. But, the analogy you gave with Jill, you call her your beautiful wife. But when you get to know her and all these things, it adds so much more depth and weight to what you mean when you say my beautiful wife, Jill. And the same thing with this. Jesus died for my sins. Okay, but let's, kind of unpack that further. Yeah. And that's what you did throughout, the rest of the message. And I just want to hone in on a couple of different aspects or parts of the message where I think we could discover a little bit more that can help us both understand and appreciate, the death of Christ and what that means for us in a new way. And so you talked about freedom happening when we step into God's design. And you were talking about sin and sin being outside of God's design. And so I want to ask on the flip side, what does it look like for us to step into God's design then?
Yeah, so I think to unpack that a little bit more in terms of like maximum freedom, I think is found in God's design. And, on Sunday I said, one of the definitions of freedom is the lack of shame. So if shame is not there, then you are completely free. And I would agree with that. I just think there's one step further, especially for a God follower, is to say like, man, is it true that maximum freedom? Is it true that maximum meaning and joy and purpose and significance and contentment is going to be found in the design of God? And I would contend and put forth and say yes. And, the way I unpack this is the idea to go, if something's created, then it's going to find its maximum potential in its creative intent. And so think about it this way, like if, it'd be kind of cool, but if I designed the iPhone, I was the creator of the iPhone, and I thought about all the things, which, by the way, I'll give credit to Steve Jobs. I won't want to take that from the late Steve Jobs. Yeah. But if I was to do that, and then I was to give it to you, and I was to say, hey, it's used for like communication, it's used for social interaction, it's used for pictures, it's used for content, and here's all the reasons I designed it, right? And you're like, Brad, this is really cool. But then you go home and you are about to go on this river and you have a canoe and you're like, I need an oar. And you find a stick in your garage and you find some Gorilla duct tape and you duct tape the iPhone because it kind of resembles an oar.
Yeah,
it
sure.
kind of, could function that way.
Hopefully it's not a big river. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to go very fast.
No.
But you could go out there and you could use the stick and you could use the iPhone as a oar. Well, is it going to be functional? Yeah, I mean,
a little.
You can probably make it work and get a little bit of momentum, right? So it can operate outside of the design, but it's not going to live its max potential. Now, if you went into Academy and bought an oar, well, an oar is like the curvatures on an oar, the lines on the oar, the whole design of it is to, maximize, the movement of water so you can wade through the water. And if you use the oar according to design, maximum freedom, maximum potential is going to be felt. Same thing with the iPhone. Is if you took the iPhone and I'm the designer and the creator of the iPhone and you use it for the content, you use it for the pictures, you're going to experience maximum freedom using it in the context of its design. And therefore, I would contend and say, in the beginning, God created you, and He created you with intrinsic worth and value. And the reason that's objective is because God makes it objective, not my opinion. So you have worth and value, and because God created you, as the scriptures go so far to say, He knit you together in your mother's womb.
He's the designer.
He is the designer. And if He's the designer, then He has a design. If He's the creator, He has a creation. And our maximum freedom is going to be found lived out in that. I'll give you one example, and there's hundreds of them. But I think, like God said, hey, I designed you not to lie. Therefore, one of the big 10 commandments, do not lie. Mm-hmm. Thou shalt not lie, right? So what lying does, what we know today, as we've kind of examined what lying does to relationships, is every time you lie, you are taking a piece of trust away from that relationship. And I tell my boys this all the time. I'm like, listen, like God designed you not to lie. But when you choose to lie, because free will is now available to you and me, we have free will. When you choose to lie, boys, that's one of the worst things you can do because it actually takes away from the relationship. It's taking trust away from the relationship, and trust is the essence of a great relationship. Well, every time you lie, you're taking more trust away and more trust away and more trust away and more trust away. And before long, you feel lonely. Before long, you feel out of sorts. Before long, there's a gap in the relationship. And it's a result of functioning, working outside of God's design. But if you choose to go, God, I trust you with the way you designed me, and I'm scared to death, but I'm going to go ahead and tell the truth, yes, there may be some short-term instability, but it can lead to that long-term intimacy. Now you are making deposits of trust. Now there's an intimacy that you are not only loved, but you're known in that relationship. There's a closeness. And now you begin to experience the truth, and you go, wow, I'm operating in the design of God. Yes, was it hard? Yes. But I am now beginning to see this freedom, maximum freedom is found in the design of God. Now, the thing that throws a wrench in all of this, again, I just mentioned, is free will. You can operate in God's design. I can operate in God's design in our relationship. But if you leverage your free will to operate outside of God's design, well, then I'm going to feel like, man, I operated in God's design, but it's not working. And that's where free will comes in to, cause brokenness, destruction, evil, all kinds of atrocities in our world that we see today.
Yeah. I think the foundational principle there is that there really is a God's design. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of times we can maybe project onto God how we would like to behave, how we would like to live life, because we think it's going to be the most freeing thing, and then we kind of subjugate God's design and we go our own way instead, and it ends up being more restrictive.
Yeah, morally there's God's design, relationally there's God's design, sexually there's God's design. I mean, he has a design, and you're absolutely right. And it does, this is sometimes I'll make this statement on Sundays, I'll say, we think God's laws or God's design feels like oppression. It's actually liberation.
Yeah.
It liberates you to something even greater. Now, as Jesus says, it may feel like you have to die to what you desire, die to what you want. I mean, he uses pretty strong language, and it's a paradox. But he says, if you're willing to give your life for me, you actually find life. Again, he's talking about what you will find is that I've come into the world to give you life and life to the full. You're actually going to find something far better than what you currently desire if you're willing to almost submit it to me and trust me with the design and operate in that way. And I've experienced that so many times in personal life. I've experienced it on the other side of individuals when it's like, but I don't feel this way. I don't desire this. But then God created, this design. Am I going to trust him? And when people do, and it's not overnight, we want instant gratification. It's over time. I've watched it time and time again, liberation, freedom.
Yeah.
There's there's a meaning, there's a purpose to be found that's far greater.
Yeah. So for somebody listening or watching, and maybe there's something which they've been pushing back on, or I think even some key questions are like, well, if I do this, I'm still kind of operating in God's design.
Sure.
If you're justifying, or how close can I get to the line without actually sinning, like those kind of things.
Yeah.
Kind of maybe the application is, I don't know, bring that to God and just go, God, I want to be obedient to, what you have, and I want to experience the freedom you have on the other side.
Yeah.
Even though it feels restrictive maybe in the moment.
Sure. And I think if you're really wrestling with it personally, I just think it's one of those, it's a paradigm shift about God, that God's a good father. He's inviting you into something so liberating and freeing and good for you. It may not feel it on the initial, but like if that's the paradigm shift versus God's oppressive and he's archaic and he just wants me to suffer for him, that's religion.
Yeah.
I think that's not. He's actually inviting you into something a lot better. But just like any good father to a son, to a daughter, the son and the daughter actually has to trust the father and has to go, I'm going to let go of what I'm holding on to. And a good father, what you're going to find on the other side of letting go is better.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great. So you encouraged us to pause knowing that Jesus is good news because he took on our sins, he satisfied justice, demonstrated love, and gave us peace. Is the purpose of the pause to focus on who God is and who we are? So value and worth made in the image of God, not what we've done, or what is the purpose of the pause in terms of how you're talking about that?
Well, the context for Sunday was probably multiple. The first thing I said that should cause us to pause is actual sin. Like when we think about sin from God's perspective, and I think when we pause in our sin to go, hey, in my marriage, I'm operating this way. In my morality, I'm operating this way. In my, whatever, pick it. The pause is to go, perhaps the reason I'm feeling worthless, perhaps the reason I'm struggling with my identity, perhaps the reason I'm struggling with meaning and purpose in my life is because of my sin. That sin has built-in consequences. In the letter of Galatians, it says God will not be mocked. You will reap what you sow. And part of the application of that point is to go, like when I choose to operate outside of God's design, God's not punishing me. He already spoke to it and said, don't do it. It's gonna.
There's natural consequences.
It's going to make your life far more complex. So now I'm wrestling with some really challenging things in my personal life, in my emotional life, in my relational life. So the pause is to go, perhaps that's a result of my sin. And sometimes we're so dismissive and we laugh sin off that, bringing it back to what sin really is and bringing sin to a reality of my life to go, oh, maybe there is something that is a cause and effect that I'm reaping and sowing and in my life. So one, pausing just helps us to, reflect a little bit more, think a little bit more, be a little bit more contemplative.
And kind of turn a different path, essentially.
Yeah, to go, maybe it's a result of sin. I think the other piece, though, on Sunday I was talking about the judgment of God and the justice of God. And the reality is, if God is who he claimed to be, and if God is who the scripture says he is, and if God is perfect, as God by definition should be, then justice should scare the hell out of us. Like, literally. And it should be to that point to go like, oh my gosh, like either I have to face God with my sin, and I have to face a God that his justice is eternal, his justice is divine, and his justice is perfect. And I've got to pause long enough to realize that there's nothing I can do to meet his perfect justice, his eternal justice, and his divine justice, because I'm not that. And I made the comment on Sunday, even if you're better than Mother Teresa, you're still going to fall short because you're not eternal. And so it should cause us to pause to go, well, what am I going to do with that? And I really hope people contend, and if you're listening or watching, like really contemplate on this. What are you going to do? And the good news and the pause of the good news is to say there is a substitute who is eternal, who is divine, who is perfect, and meets all the standards of God's justice, which is Jesus. And that pausing should be, I can't make it on my own. I desperately am in need of a Savior to step in for not only to satisfy God's justice for my sin, but to meet the requirements of his justice, which I'll never meet. And that's a wonderful thing to pause. And I think it's a wonderful thing to pause and then go, if he steps in for my sin, then what I have done, I am forgiven. That there is liberation, that there is, the shackles of shame begin to go away, which again is why I alluded to earlier, freedom begins to happen. And when you begin to experience that freedom, oftentimes shame begets shame. Like the more shame I feel, the more I do the things that create the more shame, therefore the more shame I feel. Now, to be free from that because you paused and realized that you are forgiven. Like, that's true. That's just not a religious or a good pastor thing to say. It's true, and it's true because of what Jesus did and God's justice and God's love, all culminating in Jesus.
It breaks that cycle when you pause like that.
Yeah, and now all of a sudden you're like, I don't have to do this.
Yeah.
Like, and that is the place that actually gives us a lot of power to be able to step into the design of God when you realize that you are completely forgiven, that you are a new creation, that you've been absolved of your guilty offenses because that's what Jesus did for you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. So encouraging all of us to pause. And I think, too, Jordan Peterson talks about mental maps. I don't know if you've heard of it. I don't remember what it's called. Maps of Meaning or something like that. Yeah. One of his first books. But he just says we all have mental maps for how we view things, view the world. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is pausing to shift our mental maps. We have mental maps in how we view God and sexuality and all of these, and Jesus and all these things and ourselves. And the pause is to go, let me pause to shift my mental map to kind of see God, see myself, see some things differently.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yep.
So on Sunday, you said God hates sin. And one of the things that is said oftentimes is God hates sin, but not the sinner. How can God hate the sin and not the sinner?
God hate this. I don't think that's possible. Yeah. So if I'm hearing the question right, if you take the scriptures and you look at it's really clear that on multiple occasions that God, when it comes to God, it compares and to sin operating outside or perverting the design of God. There's multiple occasions to say he sees it the way that he sees it, as something filthy, as something outside of, as something that's the opposite of holy. And so, from the scriptures, it's like God detests it, and God hates sin. So it's really important. This is kind of the answer to the question is going to be in a paradox. And so let me just preface it with that.
It's tricky.
It's tricky because there are multiple things that are true at the same time. What I mean by that is, yes, God hates sin. I mean, as any good father would hate sin, because sin entangles, sin enslaves, sin confuses, sin numbs, sin keeps you from experiencing the freedom and liberation God has for you. And any good father would look at his son or daughter, and that's happening to them. They would go, I hate that. I detest that. So that's important. That's truth number one. Truth number two is when you read the Psalms, that God absolutely says that I hate the wicked. Well, the wicked is synonymous with sin. And so if you think about God's justice, as we just alluded to, that you will have to stand before God, and that God's divine, perfect, eternal justice will be carried out. Like, God is not going to have that justice on someone he's going, oh, I absolutely love. That they're like, it's not I approve of, and my justice is being carried out. So truth number 2 is absolutely God hates the sin and God hates the sinner. But equally so, and you cannot miss this. Don't jump off this podcast right now because you're tempted right now to jump.
Yeah.
God loves the sinner as well. And John is very clear about that John says, for God so loved the world. So yes, all of these are true. This is the paradox that's at play. Sin's a really big deal. God hates it. And when we choose to sin, and that's the posture, and we choose not to do anything with our sin except saying, this is what I will do, and I reject God and reject Jesus. Yes, God hates the wicked. And that justice will be carried out. And he's not going to carry out his divine, perfect, eternal justice on someone he approves. And at the exact same time, he knows the dilemma. And because he is a good God and he does love, he sends his son into the world to demonstrate the fact that he loves the sinner, that he loves someone who's choosing sin with our free will. And he's willing to do whatever it takes to prove that love, to woo you, to do everything he can for you to trust in his son, Jesus. And Jesus is the one that demonstrates the love of God to say, I will deal with the sin so that now you can become a new creation, that you can become a son or daughter of God. John says it very well. To those who receive, to those who believe, you have a right to become a son or daughter of God. God has provided a ultimate way, a way that everyone is invited and everyone gets in the same way. It's the most loving and simplistic thing a good father could have done, to say, yes, I love you. And I have taken away, I've provided a way to not only demonstrate that, but for a way for you and I to have peace. One of the reasons God hates sin is because it separates you from him. And he so longs for you and him to be in a right relationship, like any good father would. But free will's at play. And as a result of free will, which I believe he will not violate, he has done everything short of changing your free will so that you could positionally change from dead to alive, from the wicked to a son or daughter of God. And all of that is found in the person of Christ, which is the greatest demonstration that he loves you.
Yeah. That is not an easy answer to go, okay, cool.
Well, there's a lot of things you got to think about.
There's a lot of nuances with it.
And, the danger in things like this, and the danger in this question, this is why I said don't jump off the podcast or turn your iPhone off or whatever, is because sometimes when we deconstruct things, we camp on the deconstructed truths of those. We can't do that. We got to keep the whole intact. So let's deconstruct for greater understanding. But then we build camps on deconstruction, and now you're saying, well, Buck says God hates sinners. And that's all you think. That's all you take away from this. That is not the whole. You've missed the whole. You've missed who God is. That, there are multiple things that are true at the same time. There are paradoxes at play. And the ultimate outcome in what is actually being said, the ultimate outcome is a demonstration of love. And it's accessible to everyone. And God is doing everything to woo everyone to put their trust or faith or confidence in Jesus Christ, not for blind faith, but for good objective reasons. There's plenty of evidence to do it. So that's all at play, and that's really important to keep in mind, because if we build camps on deconstructed truths, then we build a lot of separation, a lot of antagonism against one another.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing that came to mind for me as you were talking is just the dichotomy, the paradox between grace and truth. Mm-hmm. That they always seem to be this tightrope, between the two. Yeah. That Jesus is the only one who knows how to walk that perfectly, because he is God. But I mean, it's like the woman caught in adultery. Everybody leaves the scene, and he says, "Hey, you're forgiven, but go and leave your life of sin." You know what I mean? And it's that grace and truth. There's grace and there's truth. And those are hard to reconcile, in our minds a lot.
Yeah, and this is our attempt to understand God in a greater way. And, it's always like your illustration, the grace and truth. It's not the balance of, it's the embodiment of.
Yeah.
Where does one begin and end? I don't know. That's God.
Yeah.
And so where do all these converging kind of paradoxical truths that I just presented beginning. I don't know. That's where you have to keep going to God. But that's what God has given us, enough truth to make sense and go, well, when there's justice at play, when there's love at play, when there's grace at play, forgiveness at play, reconciliation, that's the components that have to be there.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say this lightly, but because I think a lot of people can point towards ignorance being bliss. But for me, when I discover something new that I don't understand about God, it points me to be in awe of him. Because I recognize if I try to understand every possible thing about God, well, I'm trying to put him in a box where he doesn't belong. Like, he's God. If God by definition, I'm not going to comprehend him. I can't even get my mind around what eternity means. Like that, I can't. Like, everything for me has a beginning and end. I cannot comprehend eternity. Yeah. And it's trying to put God in a box, And so we bump into these things. It's, wow, God, you're bigger than I can understand. And I also know you love me through the person of Jesus. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, there's this term that I hate and love. It's called skeptical theism. And it's like, I don't like it because the front-facing, of those two words together.
Yeah.
And I'm not being a skeptic about being a theist, but what I am being a skeptic about is the idea to go, I have so much more to learn about God. And I think one of the points we make a lot here, and I've said before, I don't have enough, I'm not infinite. I'm very finite. I have my 70, 80, 90, 100 years, that's it. Well, what I've learned in life is
Dr. Sinclair, maybe 110.
I know. Maybe 150. But even at 150, I will gain more perspective, and I will see things differently. And when I'm 100, if that's Dr. David Sinclair, if I'm 100, I'll go, hey, I think this is why it happened. But when I'm 125, I may know why it happened. And it may have seemed bad at the time, evil at the time, but now I see the good and the fairness of what happened, because time gave me that perspective. Time is a prerequisite of the big picture. God is infinite, I'm finite. And so therefore, I'm not God. And there's so many things that I should be like a skeptic on and going, I don't know, I need to learn. I don't know, I need to learn. I don't know, I'd like to learn. And so my finite life, I'm only going to learn so much.
Yeah. And that's where that term mental maps seems significant to me too, because so many people run their faith based on what they can understand, and that's their mental map. When you change that mental map to, I want to learn more about God, understanding I'll never fully know who he is and all the things about him, but that's a beautiful part of the process, and and that's a shift in a mental map.
Well, that's the letter of Job in the Old Covenant. That's the whole point at the end of the letter. He asked, I think it's 60 some odd questions. Where were you, Job, when I created the foundations? Where were you when I limited the whole point of that is, Job, trust me. I'm God,
you
and
can't see the big picture.
Are not. And there's also this component that we talk about internally. I don't know why I said it that way. You and I in our relationship talk about why would I call it. That's
we don't talk about it on the podcast all the time.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for the interpretation. But the idea is if you believe there's a God, then you also and there's a life, then there's life after this life, because that's what he promised. Well, if there's life after this life, it gets so many answers and so much context to what we experience in this very finite, short life that's like a flash. And in that life to come, so many things will be discovered. So many things in heaven will be understood, and we'll have so many of those aha moments. And they're to come.
Which I wanted to ask you, this is going off the questions, but David Sinclair, is he a follower of Jesus? No. See, I had that thought because I just thought anybody who's like a, practicing, follower of Christ, generally you don't really want to extend this life. I mean, you want to live a good life, full life, you want to love people well, but generally it seems like a futile exercise to try to grasp life and be like, I'm going to live as long as I can, and that's going to give me complete fulfillment, because if there's heaven on the other side of this, then I don't know why I would want to do that.
Yeah, well, I think, if he is successful, that's going to open up a whole new category of questions and a whole new category of problems and a whole new category of existential questions that are really, really heavy ones to go, whoa, now that you can live 1,000 years, what do you think about that?
Yep.
And, who knows if he'll be successful. And, again, this is where I'm I'll learn as I go. I have today. God is the God of tomorrow. What's going to happen tomorrow? We can speculate all day long, but he knows. And so I trust him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Okay, last question.
Okay.
Then if Jesus is good news as followers, what are some practical ways we can keep that fact at the forefront? As non-followers, what are some safe ways we can get answers to our questions or gather practical information? So there are two. So first, for followers of Jesus, what are some practical ways we can keep that good news at the forefront of our minds?
Yeah, I think when you said that, one of the things that came to mind is Paul says to young Timothy in the letter 1 Timothy, he says, hey, physical training is of some value, so it's good. So work out, young Timothy. But he says the spiritual training, that's where it's at. There's great value there. So I share that just to say, there are things called spiritual disciplines, just like there are physical disciplines, just like there are disciplines in every respective area. There's disciplines in the spiritual life, and this is why, like things like reading your Bible, this is things like praying, this is things like inviting God in the prayer series we just did, and inviting God in because he already knows, taking those postures. This is things like memorizing scripture. This is things like fasting. This is things like, our culture would call it meditating. As a follower of Christ, I would say being still before God and until the place that I can know he's God. These disciplines in themselves are not these religious practices, so I feel guilty and I feel shame and I feel less than and I'm terrible because I don't do them. There is a tremendous benefit to doing these. And just like if I physically decide to work out, it doesn't benefit me like I work out one time and boom, I lost 20 pounds. There is this perseverance. There is this playing the long game to go, man, the more I work out, the healthier I feel, the clearer my thoughts are. I feel better about myself. I feel better in terms of my energy. I feel better in terms of my thinking. In the same way, the more that you prioritize the spiritual disciplines, and there's many of them, the more you're able to see what God has done for you, and the more God feels like like you're walking with him every step of the way. The more things like, hey, that you are sealed with the very Holy Spirit, the very presence of God lives in you, which means every single nanosecond of your life, you're never alone. God is there with you. Now, the question is, do you recognize that or not? Do you know that or not? Because once you begin to know that, that is life-changing. That is like every moment, every situation, every hardship, every emotion. I'm inviting God, and God is meeting me in a new way. Well, how is he meeting me in a new way? Well, the spiritual disciplines are opening the doors and the windows and perspectives to how God is meeting me, and all of a sudden I feel so alive, and this life in Christ is adventurous. Well, that's how you see these incredible truths. There has to be some sort of spiritual disciplines front and center. Apathy, or as I said on Sunday, being lukewarm, or gosh, I know I should read my Bible, or gosh, I know I should pray, or gosh, I know I should. I get it. Like at an emotional level, I get it. But at a very practical level, eventually, just like atrophy will start to happen to my body, it will start to happen to your perspective and your faith. So as a follower of Christ, spiritual disciplines are really important. As if you're not a follower of Christ, curiosity, I would say, is the key. Just be curious. Just as I, kind of a skeptical theist, skeptical theism, I would just say, as much as you can, be curious. Read. There's great resources to read. I think podcast. William Lane Craig is a guy I'm listening to all the time lately. I would highly recommend him. He was voted top 50 philosophers in the world. And that's of, I think there were only 3 followers of Christ in that whole list, 47 non. He was one of the guys who was. He answers some of the hardest questions that are out there, and he gives reasons to put your faith in, your trust in the fact that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and he gives good reasons why why God exists. If you start with that as a baseline, does God even exist? Well, be curious about that. If you walk in with presuppositions already, firmed up in your mind, God does not exist. Well, you can read 100 books, but you've already decided God doesn't exist, so you're no longer curious. I would just say be curious and read the books and ask the questions. And as I said on Sunday, come meet. I think free speech and conversation and me looking at you with intrinsic worth and value allows you to have all your opinions, even if they differ with mine. And my hope is you would give me the autonomy, because you see me with value and worth, to allow me to put forth my opinions. Well, in the discourse of our discussion and that free speech, perhaps in that discussion we can discover what is actually true, and we can reason together. And that's why the invitation on Sunday was, please call Northpoint, please email Northpoint. Let us reason together. with the questions that you have between you and putting your faith in Jesus Christ. And I think that's one of the best things you can do.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind for me was a book by Peter Scazzaro called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And he talks about how, on everybody's kind of spiritual journey, and this would definitely be more for the follower of Christ, but apathy sinks in when we forget, for lack of a better way to describe it, we forget the drops of blood that were shed for us by Christ. Apathy begins to set in. Faith becomes a checkbox. But when we put ourselves at the foot of the cross and we're reminded of that on a daily basis, it puts us in this posture just to see ourselves and God and people and everybody so clearly. And Peter Scazzaro in this book, he just says a spiritual kind of marker of someone's growing or maturing in their faith is on a regular prayer life. Habitually they're saying something or they're quoting scripture that just puts them back at the foot of the cross. So he says his is every morning he gets up and he says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And God has already forgiven him, and God has already, he knows those things, but it's a reminder for him. He's a sinner in need of grace. And for me, one of the things I just say is, God, apart from you, I'm nothing. You're the vine, I'm just a branch. If I disconnect from you, I become lifeless. God, apart from you, I'm nothing. And so I would encourage someone who's a follower of Christ on that bend just to, add that to their prayer life or some sort of habit or something. I don't know if you have something similar. I've heard you say things, God, give me everything I need for life and godliness, like those kind of things too over the years as well.
Yeah, I take a little bit more positive approach.
No,
I think that's fantastic. I think I say all the time, like, hey, you fearfully and wonderfully made me.
Yeah.
And God, you've given me everything I need.
I'm like, God, I suck.
No, don't hear that. No, I think that, it's like, we're talking about our new series coming up, and the whole idea, like, when you look at the world, like, man, this world is not our home. It's broken.
Yeah.
Well, then your perspective is you probably will have far more good days than bad days.
Yeah.
But if you look at this world from a perspective to go, hey, this world is heaven, it's awesome, I should be blessed every second of the day, then you're going to have far more bad days than good days.
Yep.
And so I think it's perspective is what you're giving. And I think that's a really good perspective, that whole idea to go, I am in desperate need of his mercy and his grace.
Yep.
That's wonderful. I think that puts a really good posture of humility. And so I think it's a both and. And at the same time, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. That's who I am.
Yeah. And I really think it is different for each person. I mean, it's for me, my tendency is to want to control. Like, I'm an Enneagram 6, and so I want to get control so I can control all the what ifs and not have to deal with the possibilities. And so I need to remember that if I try to control apart from God, if I think I'm a branch and I'm going to produce all this fruit on my own, then I'm doing it in vain, So that's my reminder for me. And so, good. For you, it's different. For everybody else, different. Positive, negative, whatever motivates you. We're all motivated differently.
There you go. I like that.
Anyways, I really hope for people who watch and listen to this series, and if you missed a part, make sure to go back and listen. But I really hope, going back to that mental map thing, that it maybe shifted some ways in which you see the laws in the Old Testament, maybe the way you see the Old Testament, the way you see Jesus, the way you see the new command, the way you see the reason Jesus had to die or why he came. I hope it's just kind of shifted your mental map to something that points ultimately to Jesus more in your life and your faith. So make sure to go back and listen if you missed something. But that's really our hope and our prayer for anybody listening or watching. And it all leads up to this week, which is Easter. And it's a surprise as to what we're going to talk about on Easter.
I know.
Nobody's going to be able to predict it.
No one will ever guess it.
But I'm really, really excited for the services we have coming. And if you're watching online or in person, they're all going to be at the same time. We're going to have 4 and 5:30. I guess it's Central Time. There are some people that are watching outside of the time zone. Central Time, 4 and 5:30 on Saturday, and then 8:30, 10 o'clock, and 11:30 on Sunday. So we hope to see you there, or if you're tuning in online, we're just grateful you're watching.
Awesome.